€2.70 for unemployed young people. Not the €5 that Minister Donoghue said that job seekers' allowance would rise by. Not the €226 extra a week that the ministers over there will benefit from. Not the €104 extra a week that TDs will benefit from. €2.70. And not a mention of it in the minister's speech. Because he was ashamed of it? Because he should be ashamed of it. It encapsulates the unfair, right-wing budget of inequality that we have. Because not only did the government decide not to undo the discrimination against young, unemployed people, they decided to double down on that discrimination. They decided to make the gap even greater. They're expected to live on €102.70 a week, while the ministers live on almost €2,000 a week. And Minister Varadkar revealed himself yesterday as the minister nasty that he is when he gave his explanation for this. Because he said that if young unemployed people were to receive €188 a week, it would be bad for them. It would be bad for them. It's the same reason that numerous homeless charities say is a driving factor in youth homelessness. I tell you what's bad for young people: homelessness, poverty. But the government decides that no, young people deserve to be discriminated against, not even to get the €5 that other groups are getting. Young people face an unemployment rate of 16%, a rate that has gone up, incidentally. 1 in 5 of them are not in training, education or unemployment, and over 30,000 are emigrating every year, and that figure did go up last year compared to the year before. And that is not their fault. It's the fault of the bankers, of the bondholders, of the parties that represent those interests, and the economic system of capitalism that crashed, and then as a result the burden was placed onto working people of all ages across this country, and they were driven into poverty, into low-paid jobs or out of the country. And now the government seeks to blame them, to discriminate against them, to ideologically demonise them, to prevent them as being responsible for their own fate. Young people will be asking the question, why does the government hate me so much? What's wrong with young people? Why don't they treat us with respect? Why don't they offer us a future? Because not only are they discriminated against in terms of social welfare, look at what they get in the minimum wage. So 1 in 8 workers under 30 are on the minimum wage. Nearly 40% of all those on the minimum wage are under 30. And what do they get? They get 10 cents extra an hour. If they're very lucky, they're on a 39-hour week and they get $3.90 extra a week. Many, of course, are on 0-hour contracts. Maybe they get 20 hours, 15 hours, something less. Much less than the fiver advertised. What we have here, amongst many other aspects, is an anti-young person budget. No future for young people, no investment in jobs for young people, no attempt to deal with the spiralling rent facing young people, an anti-young people budget. Others, pensioners, people with disabilities, people on a low or medium wage got less than a fiver. Or they got an amount dressed up and delayed to look like a fiver. That's it. That's it from the point of view of what people got. Dressed up in the language of fairness, we have a budget written by Fine Gael, Fianna Fail and right-wing independents. It's written with the advice of Ireland's own Donald Trump, Michael O'Leary, and contains exactly the sort of measures that you would expect from that source. What we have is a very right-wing budget. It's a budget that will reinforce the vast inequalities that exist in our society. It's a free market budget, it's a builder's budget, it's a landlord's budget, and it's a big business budget. And so we oppose this budget. We oppose the pay rises for TDs and ministers and the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach. We represent working people, and it's a principle for us that we will only take an average worker's wage, precisely so we don't become completely out of touch with the people that we represent, like so many people in here. James Connolly wrote about ruling by fooling, and he described it as a great British art. Well, it's clearly an art that the government is trying to mimic, but unfortunately for them an art that they haven't mastered. Because they would like this idea that this is a late budget, that there's something for everyone in the audience. But what they're really trying to do, it's like the loaves and fishes, but with 4 million people instead of 4,000 and with no ability to conduct miracles, to take a tiny amount of money in terms of the fiscal space and that they're going to allocate to ordinary people as opposed to the tax breaks for corporations, for higher earners, etc., and then try and dress it up. And so what is a €4 increase, for example, for pensioners next year, over the course of the year, becomes a €5 increase. While cigarettes go up tonight, people will wait until March to get the fiver that this budget is the only thing the budget is delivering for people. It's reminiscent of Del Boy and Rodney's tax in the post in the window of their van. The fiver is in the post. It's coming sometime next year, together with many other things in this budget. It's a trick of people, and people won't be fooled. People will see it for what it is. They think, OK, we might get a fiver in a few months' time if we're lucky, but they know that that will quickly, even before they get the fiver, it'll be eaten up by rents that are soaring, by increased medical insurance, by increased car insurance, by the cost of living crisis that results from the neoliberal economic policies that have been pursued and that are reinforced in this budget. There's meagre increases for low-paid people, for those on social welfare and pensioners, for people with disabilities. Look at the other side of that. There's a whole series of tax cuts for the wealthy and for big business. IBEC, which represents big businesses in this country, it had obviously pre-budget lobbying, pre-budget statement, and they had a wish list. And their wish list, unlike the wish list for young unemployed people, unlike the wish list for those on the minimum wage, unlike the wish list for workers, their wish list has largely been ticked off. They wanted capital gains tax on sales of businesses cut from 20% to 10%. Tick, Minister Noonan delivers. It's a race to the bottom style cut to compete with Britain in the context of Brexit. The cut to inheritance tax. That is a cut that will only reinforce inequality. That's the direct effect that it will have. A small number of people will benefit, and it will reinforce the inequality that exists in our society. The extension of Special Assignee Relief Programme, a tax break for corporate executives working in Ireland. Minister Noonan tells us there will be a tax cut for share options, another IBEC demand, but with no details of costings yet, and a reduction in dirt by 2% a year over the next 4%, a cost this year of €9 million, a similar cost over the next number of years. Or look at the changes in incomes that have taken place as a result of the tax changes. These again are regressive measures. So a single person earning €12,000 a year gets €3 a week. At €20,000 to €25,000 a year, they get €2 a week, whereas someone, a couple on €90,000 a year would get €855 over the course of the year. So employees, people who are on €70,000 plus, are getting twice to 3.5 times as much as those who are on the median wage, those in the middle in terms of earnings. And the biggest benefits are going to a single self-employed person on €70,000 plus, who's getting €14 extra, 7 times as much as a single person earning $20,000 to €25,000. Look at the absence of anything in terms of providing for people with disabilities. Yes, you throw them an extra fiver, but you take no account of the extra costs facing people as a result of the disability, which can be over €200 for many people. And when funding has been cut for people with disabilities by €159 million from 2008 to 2015, it's very, very unlikely that that cut to any significant degree is going to be undone given the increase in the health spending. To take a look at the kind of society that we live in, and then have a think about what kind of budget this is going to, the impact our budget is going to have. Obviously we know, and they know now they shouldn't have said it, although they thought it, that Fine Gael told us that we should keep the recovery going. But many workers felt then that there was no recovery and feel now that there's no recovery. What matters for people is people's living standards, good jobs, decent wages, affordable basic living costs like housing, childcare, and disposable incomes that allow people to feel that they're living as opposed to just scraping by, just existing. And in those terms, the recovery is a mirage. Irish living standards are the 4th lowest in the EU 15 at 12.5% below the average. Disposable incomes are 10% lower than before the crash. And there is a huge cost of living crisis. And the cost of living crisis comes because, on the one hand, you have low pay. Ireland is a low-wage economy, the third highest rate of low pay in the OECD, combined with completely underfunded, devastated public services that result in soaring costs for housing, for childcare, for insurance. And so, for even those who get the meagre €5, they know it will be more than taken away by the rising costs on the other hand. Years of austerity and regressive budgets have served their purpose. They have deepened inequality to a point where the richest 10% of the population in Ireland control 54% of the net wealth, leaving just 5% for the bottom 50%. They've also driven, which in my opinion is their purpose, a transfer of wealth, a shift from wages to profits. So workers' wages still remain lower than in 2008, in weekly terms or in hourly terms. But they've also fallen as a percentage of GDP from 53% in 2008 to a projected 40% next year. And what happened to corporate profits? They went from 35 billion in 2009, 51 billion in 2014 and 75 billion in 2015. The recovery is certainly working very well for some, and it's working the way it's meant to in terms of austerity policies, neoliberal policies, driving a shift of wealth. And what's contained in the budget is more of that same right-wing economic policies. It's a very, very right-wing budget. It has a very free market approach, even when it's attempting or pretending to attempt to deal with the problems that face people. In every possible area, you have a further drive towards marketisation, towards liberalisation. In housing, in childcare, in education, in transport. It's an explicitly neoliberal free market approach which will reinforce those inequalities of the system, which will make the cost of living crisis get worse for people, but will make some people, the kind of people who support, the kind of people who are represented by Fine Gael, make them a lot richer. Take the case of childcare. We know that this is a crisis facing many families. Effectively, it's a second mortgage for people. The average Irish family pays 34% of their household income on childcare, compared to just 3% in Austria and 6% in Sweden. Parents need to earn around €30,000 a year just to fund the cost of childcare for 2 children. The consequence is that many women are forced out of the workplace. 84% of stay-at-home mothers want to work but are trapped by childcare costs, and it also contributes to pay inequality, with women with children aged 25 to 44 earning 31% less than men. And so what's the government's answer? And this apparently is the centrepiece of the budget. The government's answer is to outsource the state's responsibility for childcare through subsidising private childcare to the tune of €120 million. It will make a small difference for some parents, and over time, as prices rise, that will be eroded. And it will swell the profits of the big providers, which are made off of the backs of a low-paid, 99% female workforce who get an average hourly wage of about €10. That sort of outsourcing by the public sector already costs the state over €11 billion a year. Fundamentally, that approach will reinforce inequality. It will reinforce the notion of a shrunken public sector that doesn't provide basic public services to the people it's supposed to. It's a neoliberal approach. The socialist alternative outlined in our budget statement was, quite simply, to develop a state-run, publicly owned national childcare system free at the point of use. We outlined how €2 billion could be invested in childcare in the first year, employing over 50,000 childcare workers, acquiring childcare facilities across the country. That would make a real difference to people's living standards, to their costs, but it's ruled out because of the neoliberal blinkers of this government. Or look at the question of housing, where it's so blatant that this is a budget for the builders and it's a budget for the landlords. Contrast the extra money to landlords to the amount of money going to be invested in building social housing. So total capital investment for local authority in all sorts of builds, of all different sorts, including Part 5, is €307 million. They're doing another €100 million, perhaps. That's money to private landlords. They're increasing mortgage relief for landlords. A transfer of wealth is taking place as opposed to actually building the homes that people need. And centrally is this notion of the so-called help to buy scheme. And I think Minister Noonan in his speech, he gave away the fact that it's rooted in an extremely right-wing Thatcherite view of how the economy works. He incredibly argued that in all markets, supply increases to meet demand, and the Help to Buy scheme will increase the demand for newly built homes by assisting first-time buyers to put a deposit together. I expect the building industry to meet this additional demand by increasing the supply of new affordable homes. It's just an article of free market faith that supply increases to meet demand. I mean, is there a problem with demand for housing in this society? That's nonsense. People are screaming for houses. First-time buyers, those in mortgage distress, those facing unaffordable soaring rents, those facing homelessness, they all face a crisis, and they're desperate for a solution. What the Minister is actually saying is that if we pump more money that ultimately will be transferred to the developers, and it's a transfer to developers, that's what it is, well then maybe the prices will go up further, and maybe that will incentivise more builders to get involved. It is not a solution for first-time buyers or for anybody else. It's another transfer from the public purse to the private profit. Developers will pocket the 20 grand per house, leaving first-time buyers and everybody else no better off. The answer, again, of course, is for the state to intervene directly to resolve the housing crisis. The government's whole plan is a plethora of grants and tax breaks for developers, landlords, other housing speculators who are profiting from the crisis. Instead, we explained in our statement how €4.5 billion could be invested to provide 50,000 new public homes next year, directly building 20,000 public homes at cost price as part of a major public housing programme to build 100,000 over the next 5 years, and acquiring 30,000 vacant homes for public housing, and provide those homes in a real public housing system to make them available to all, to rent or buy, based on a system of differential rents and mortgages ranging from 10 to 25% of income. You have another tax relief for landlords. Incredibly, they're saying it's to stop, Minister Noonan is saying it's to stop landlords from exiting the market. Quite incredible when they're making massive profits already. The 5% increase in relief, it won't make any difference to people in long-term arrears. That money will be better spent on having state-owned banks like AIB write down buy-to-let arrears and take them into public ownership for public housing. Instead, the banks and the state stands by while thousands of buy-to-let tenants stand to be evicted. Instead, the extra relief is going to act to encourage landlords to take out new buy-to-lets and will increase competition for limited supply of housing and will drive up prices even further. That's the market solution to the housing crisis, and it's a disaster. Look at the question of education, which I don't think anyone has picked up on yet. Minister Donoghue made a quite interesting reference to, quote, initiating a consultation process on the design and operation of an exchequer employer investment mechanism to operate from 2018 onwards. That's in the context of the Cassell's report and of the crisis for funding in third-level education. Exchequer employer investment mechanism. It's a nice term for the further corporatisation of our education system. What that means is big business getting an input into the shaping of our third-level education, or a greater input than they already have in reality. And in other areas of education, doing nothing in terms of the pupil-teacher ratio. The question of transport, briefly, again, 3 new major public-private partnerships, another handout to major construction firms, which will likely see a further expansion of rip-off regressive tolling. On healthcare, instead of building a national health service that could be done, that could be achieved, that could get rid of the 2-tier health service that we have, a drive to the National Treatment Purchase Fund, ending up in private hospitals as opposed to the necessary investment. In every single respect, this is a big business budget and a free market budget. But it's even more than that. It's a budget made for an Apple Republic. It's made for a country whose establishment, like those of Panama, like those of the Cayman Islands, has a developmental strategy built on so-called tax competition, in reality operating as a tax haven. Minister Noonan claims, quote, that our corporate tax regime meets the highest standards in tax transparency. It doesn't. And nobody believes it does. To quote Philip Aston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, nobody believes Ireland is not a tax haven. And the cost of this tax avoidance, Ireland's operation as a tax haven, as part of a global chain of tax evasion that takes place, is massive on a global scale. $200 billion stolen from poor developing countries and stolen from workers right around the world, including in Ireland. The only winners of such a strategy of tax competition are the big businesses who benefit from it and a small number of accountants and lawyers who make their money off it, including in this country. But look at what the Minister is doing about it. You have token clampdowns on tax avoidance. Look at the figure that Minister Noonan gives for the clampdown on the Section 110 loophole. He says 50 million could be raised. More than $1 billion of tax is avoided through the Section 110. And he says 50 million could be raised because he doesn't actually plan to close the loopholes. Look at the extra amount to be raised from offshore tax evasion, only 30 million. That's a drop in the ocean considering Ireland's role as a tax haven. Or even only getting 50 million extra from hiring 50 extra Revenue Commissioner staff. There was an incredible figure a few weeks ago where the CNAG report found that 40% of people or companies randomly audited by the Revenue hadn't paid their tax, hadn't paid their sufficient tax, with an average payment due of €18,500 each. If we invested more in Revenue, went after the tax avoidance that exists and tax evasion in that case, well then more money could be raised. The truth is, and this is a scary truth from the point of view of the government, that Apple is only the tip of the iceberg. More cases will be taken by the European Commission. 70% of corporations in Ireland do not pay any corporation tax. Google paid a corporate tax rate of 0.14% between 2005 and 2011. Starbucks paid a grand total of €45. That's €45, not €45 million, €45,000. Starbucks paid €45 last year. Vulture funds, feasting on the carcasses of the property crash, paid €250 tax on billions of euros in assets. But the government is doing nothing. As Richard mentioned, the double Irish tax scam will remain open until 2020. The Knowledge Development Box, which is the replacement for the double Irish, will cost €550 million to the public this year. And Section 110 and the other loopholes will cost €1 billion. And so, the only thing that Minister has announced is a review, a one-man commission review of Ireland's tax haven status, with the explicit condition that you can't touch the 12.5%. And he's asked Seamus Coffey to do it. And Seamus Coffey, of course, is a well-known economist. I'm sure the Minister is aware of his views on these issues. And he has been quite forthright in his views. For example, he said, quote, "What the Commission have done in the case of Apple goes against all principles of taxation," in an article entitled "Why Tax Campaigners Should Be Aghast at the Apple Ruling." He said that the €2.3 billion rise in corporation tax was real, that it wasn't a distortion. There's no doubt that a 26% real GDP growth is bizarre, but it was not farcical, false or based on fairy tales. So now we understand why Minister Noonan has chosen Seamus Coffey. He has a particular view on this, and his view is that Ireland is not a tax haven, has nothing to answer for, so that's fine from the point of view of Minister Noonan. Minister Noonan previously said that the corporate tax rate, and he repeats it in the speech today, never has been and never will be up for discussion. So young people's dole, payments for people with disability, the arts budget, everything else is up for discussion, it's up for a debate. But corporate tax is above democracy. You cannot decide to ask those corporations who are making massively increased profits to pay taxes. Well, I have news for Minister Noonan and the government. We don't accept that it's untouchable. We think that all the loopholes should be closed immediately. The double Irish, the Knowledge Development Box, Section 110. And in addition, the Anti-Austerity Alliance is arguing that a new rate of corporation tax for big business should be introduced. For profits in excess of €800,000, that the corporate tax rate for them should be doubled to 25%, linked to a strategy of public investment and shifting the economy, transforming the economy from a corporate tax haven to a socialist green economy. Briefly, I think that the fiscal space has served its purpose. The purpose of the fiscal space is not to ensure that we have sustainable growth. The purpose of the fiscal space is to be very convenient politically in order to be a trick of misdirection, to say, don't worry and don't discuss the big cake of €230 billion worth of output over here. Don't talk about the €75 billion worth of corporate profits over here. Instead, talk over here about the 1 billion, 1.2 or 1.3 billion euros, which is effectively crumbs. And that's how they managed to construct a pre-budget debate where the highlight is a debate about whether pensioners or people with disabilities or carers deserve a €5 increase more. That is an encapsulation of the fiscal space neoliberal economics in action, artificially creating scarcity, pitting people against each other to fight over who gets what. We reject that scarcity. We reject that fiscal space. We break out of the straitjacket of what that means. The truth is that the EU Commission ruling on Apple, the fantastical 26% growth figures, they shine a light onto the real nature of the Irish economy as a fiscal paradise for the multinationals and the rich, while failing to deliver for working people. And the starting point of a real alternative, as a starting point of the AAA PPP and the AAA budget statements, is breaking out of the straitjacket of the fiscal space and rejecting the notion and the strategy of Ireland being a corporate tax haven, saying that that has resulted in a weak domestic private sector and a basket case economy where growth figures have no relationship to the reality of the economy or people's lives, and that we need a rupture from that developmental model, a rupture from the capitalist system. The Apple tax scandal demonstrates very clearly, and it does demonstrate for people, and there's people out there watching, that the obstacle to resolving the massive social crises that face people is not a lack of resources, it's not a lack of wealth, they are plentiful. It's political decisions, rules, and fundamentally the capitalist free market system which says that the profit of the 1% should come first. The centrepiece of our statement of our strategy is breaking with that model, which has a situation where Michael Noonan is still talking about FDI as the seed potatoes of economic development 60 years after this strategy was originally introduced, rejecting the notion of being a tax haven, scrapping the loopholes, increasing rates, raising at least £4 billion. It's to say that we don't accept that the question of debt has just gone off the public agenda, except for the government to kind of looking for an even better pat on the head from the EU Commission and the rest of the Troika, say we're going to pay even more of the debt down. But in a situation where the state spends €1 in every €10 raised in tax on debt servicing, for debt that largely arises from the banking crisis and is not ours, that has to be part of the debate. We therefore put forward a strategy of debt repudiation, which would conservatively save at least €3.22 billion. We put forward the need to scrap austerity taxes for working people, to scrap the water charges and to refund those who paid, to scrap the property tax and to scrap the USC, and in their place put forward a series of other taxation measures. Those include the introduction of a new millionaires tax. It's a tax on net assets exceeding €1 million of 2%, which would raise almost €3 billion. A landlord's tax on non-family homes, which would raise €450 million. And a high-income social charge and new rates of marginal tax on high levels of income to replace the USC and to raise €2.33 billion. In addition, we pointed to the almost €9 billion available in NAMA and the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund. These are funds that are incredibly not allowed to be spent because of the expenditure benchmark fiscal rule. They are funds that are there but cannot be spent. That rule, just like the fiscal space and all the fiscal rules, must be broken, and those funds used to fund major capital programmes in housing, renewable energy, water, health and childcare. As I outlined earlier, we put forward an ambitious plan to build or acquire 50,000 homes. Instead of treating our two-tier health service as an inevitability, we advocated spending an additional €3 billion on health in 2017 as part of developing an NHS in this country. That would fund an additional 1,000 acute beds, 5,000 additional healthcare workers, abolition of prescription charges, the allocation of an additional €200 million to mental health alongside other measures. As mentioned, the development of a national childcare scheme, and in addition calling for more than €1 billion into education, providing genuinely free education at all levels, free school books, an end to all voluntary contributions and an end to third-level fees. And in addition, we budgeted to have full pay equality in the public sector, to do away with a situation where so-called new entrants are discriminated against, and for an immediate restoration of pay to 2008 levels. Finally, we argued for investment. Massive public investment. There's huge underinvestment in this economy, both by the public and the private sector. We argued for €3 billion directly by the state to create 50,000 jobs in renewable energy, water infrastructure, forestry and green agri-food. Just to finish, the central point is that the problem is not one of resources. The problem is how those resources are owned, how those resources are controlled. A left government with socialist policies, both through taxation but also through public ownership of the banking system, the key sectors of the economy, would enable a paradigm shift in the economy based on renewable energy and sustainable growth, a socialist green economy.
Murphy, we move on now.